Conservatives will often say that the United States is a Christian country founded on Christian values. But when you actually look into the history of the founding of the United States and the beliefs of the founding fathers, you will quickly discover that the United States was actually an experiment in reviving a classical pagan civilization. First of all, the founding fathers themselves were largely not traditional Christians. Most of them believed in something more akin to deism, which is the belief in a creator god who stands beyond nature, something more in alignment with Plato's idea of the one than the Christian idea of God. The founding fathers believed in natural law, in reason, and various other products of Enlightenment thought, which sought to ground religion and the state essentially in nature and the natural world. Thomas Jefferson did not believe in the Trinity or in the divinity of Christ, and he actually created a version of the Bible, the Jeffersonian Bible, where he cut out all references to the supernatural or the miraculous. So while he believed in the idea of God, he did not believe in Christianity or Christian theology. He just viewed Jesus as a spiritual teacher. John Adams, Ben Franklin, George Washington, and James Madison all held similar beliefs to Jefferson, and they of course believed in religious freedom and the separation of church and state. These were men who sought to break away from the traditional Christian monarchy of England. They sought freedom in the frontier and truth in nature. If the founding fathers had wanted to make the United States a traditional Christian society, they easily could have. But instead, they wrote religious freedom into the Constitution and modeled their new republic on classical and Enlightenment ideas about government, nature, and man. The founding fathers were steeped in the writings of the ancient Greeks and Romans, and they chose to model their new republic on the Republic of Rome, complete with a Senate and a Capitol Hill, named after Rome's Capitoline Hill. The symbolic language of the United States is also overtly classical, using symbols like the fasces, the Roman eagle, which was adopted as the symbol of the Republic, and of course the actual architecture which emulates classical style. And all of this symbolism is not just a superficial emulation of Rome. Behind it lies a very deep symbolic meaning which cuts to the very core of what Western civilization really is, something which the founding fathers understood well. On the back of the Great Seal of the United States is the Latin phrase Novus Ordo Seclorum, a new order of the ages, which is also found on the dollar bill. A lot of times you'll see online people saying that this is proof of a one world government Masonic conspiracy being part of the United States founding. And the founding fathers were absolutely influenced by Masonry, itself a product of rationalism and Enlightenment thought, and many of them were Masons. Hence the pyramid and the eye on the US seal and dollar. But Novus Ordo Seclorum has nothing to do with that. Charles Thomas took it from Virgil's fourth eclogue. It is not a direct quote, but a kind of rephrasing of the line, Magnus ab integro Seclorum nascitur ordo. That means a great order of the ages is born anew, or out of scratch, from scratch. Virgil, of course, was the famous Roman poet who wrote the Aeneid, and so we can go to the eclogue and actually read the original lines here. Now the final age foretold by the Cumaean Sibyl has come and passed, and the great cycle of centuries begins again. That's the line right there. Justice returns, and the reign of Saturn returns too, with a new generation of humanity sent from heaven, at the birth of a child who will end the Iron Age and bring forth a golden race. Help him, pure Lucina. He is your own. Apollo now rules. During your consulship, Pollio, this glorious age will begin, and the months will start their powerful course. Under your leadership, any traces of our past evil, once removed, will free the world from constant fear. He will gain the life of the gods and witness heroes mixing with gods, and he himself will be seen among them, and with his father's virtue will rule over a world at peace. So what the heck is Virgil talking about here? Virgil was writing these lines after the death of Julius Caesar, and it seems pretty clear that he is speaking of the young Augustus, Caesar's adopted son and soon-to-be first emperor of Rome, bringing the dawning of a new golden age, restoring order to Rome after all this turmoil and strife. Virgil and Augustus would go on to be close friends, and Virgil would even write Augustus into the Aeneid as a divinely mandated figure, a savior of Rome. So the father's virtue here would reference Caesar, of course, and this golden age of peace would be the anticipated age of peace under Augustus's rule, which would actually come to pass in the Pax Romana, with the rule of the so-called 5 good emperors, which began with Augustus in 27 BC and ended with the death of Marcus Aurelius in 180 AD. So this phrase on the seal evokes Rome and the dawning of a new golden age, although in this case a republican one, not an imperial one. On the Great Seal of the United States, below this paraphrase of Virgil, there is another Latin phrase which reads annuit coeptis. This also might be a reference to Virgil, although its origins are less certain. It means he favors our undertakings, and it could be from the Aeneid, from the line Jupiter omnipotens audacibus adnue coeptis, which translates to Jupiter Almighty, favor my bold undertakings, and it is said by Ascanius, Aeneas' son. It could also be from Virgil's earlier poem, the Georgics, Da facilem cursum atque audacibus annue coeptis. That annue coeptis is pretty close to annuit coeptis. And this line in Georgics is addressed to Augustus and translates to give us an easy path and nod at our audacious undertakings. If it is taken from Virgil, I'd say this is much more likely, since again, it references Augustus here, and the lines are pretty similar. Okay, so the founding fathers really liked the Romans, but so what? Who cares? As I was saying earlier, it's a lot deeper than a superficial emulation of Rome. We often say that Western civilization began with the Greeks, but what does that really mean? The Greeks were just Greeks, and at the time, there were other complex societies in Northern Europe, of which modern, quote-unquote, Western civilization receives an equal amount of heritage. But the Greeks did not see themselves as part of the same civilization, that is the same cultural, ethnic, religious cluster as the Germanic tribes. So it was really the Romans who absorbed much of Greek culture and posited themselves as the inheritors and continuers of Hellenic civilization, who created the idea of Western civilization. That is the idea of historical continuity between various European civilizations and the peoples who founded them. And this idea is most clearly laid out in Virgil's Aeneid. When Virgil set out to write a Roman national epic, he chose to continue the Greek epic cycle, the Iliad and the Odyssey, rather than make it about something which might seem more obvious, like Romulus and Remus. The Aeneid follows the Trojan hero Aeneas as he flees the ransacked Troy, picking up directly after the events of the Iliad. Aeneas is told that he is destined to found a new civilization on the shores of Italy, which will rule the world, and the epic follows his journey to bring his people to this new promised land and establish their new home. Now, it's important to note that Virgil did not invent this idea. It had been around for a long time. He did, however, elaborate on it and legitimize it and eternalize it in the Aeneid. He made it official, an official part of Rome's history and founding. And this does a few different things. It ties Roman civilization to Greek civilization, and it ties the Romans to the Greeks, or rather to their Trojan neighbors, ethnically or genealogically. The epic concisely says, our civilizations and our peoples have a shared root, shared ancestry, and a shared history. Our civilization is a continuation of yours. And in many ways this was true, considering how much of Hellenic and Greek culture the Romans absorbed and continued. Now, when Rome fell, when the Western Roman Empire fell, this tradition was continued on the European continent by the Germans and Franks, with Charlemagne being crowned the Roman emperor, and of course was also continued by the Byzantines in a different way. The Franks and Normans often view themselves as descendants of the Trojan refugees, continuing this myth, kind of similar to the lost tribes of Israel phenomena. The sack of Constantinople was even portrayed as Trojan vengeance on the Greeks, i.e. the Byzantines, for the sack of Troy in antiquity. So this idea of Trojan origins continued, and the northern tribes saw themselves as the successors to Rome and converted to Roman culture, to Christianity. In the 1130s AD, the Welsh historian Geoffrey of Monmouth, in his Historia Regum Britanniae, wrote that Aeneas' grandson Brutus sailed to Britain and founded Britain, named after him. Geoffrey's work outlines a long line of kings descended from the Trojan Brutus, and culminating with King Arthur. So his work serves the same purpose as the Aeneid did. It pushes the connection between the British and the Romans to long before Rome's conquest of Britain and the establishment of Britannia. In the end, Arthur dies, the last of the mythic kings, and the Saxons take over England, which reflects the actual historical reality of what happened. After the collapse of Rome, the Britons, then having adopted Roman Christian culture, defended themselves against the invading Saxons, who were still pagan, but eventually succumb. At Tintagel, where Arthur is said to have lived, we have evidence of a strongly fortified settlement, and also, very interestingly, evidence of continued trade with the Mediterranean by sea, all the way from England. So, like the myth of Aeneas, Joffrey's history, while largely mythic, does reflect historical realities and lends the authority of Rome to the British, to Britain. And the British, of course, would go on to gain a massive empire like that of the Romans. Okay, so now with this context, let's take another look at the largely English settlers of North America. They set out from their homeland across an ocean in search of a new land, in search of establishing a new republic, a new Rome, which itself, mythologically, was a new Troy. Now the picture begins to become clear. This new American republic was meant to continue the chain of Western civilization, from Troy to Britain, and now to the Americas. And this new Roman-style republic would mark the birth of a new, golden, classical age. Just as Virgil wrote that a corrupt Rome would be renewed under Augustus, now, on the shores of this new continent, a new Britain, a new Rome, a new Troy will be reborn, freed from the corruption and bonds of the old world. Now that's a little bit different than the classic America was a Christian country narrative, isn't it? In addition to its classical foundations, the formation of the United States was also deeply influenced by Germanic and Anglo-Saxon pagan traditions, since the original settlers were predominantly English. When Jefferson, Adams, and Franklin were designing the Great Seal for the United States, the one which has those Latin phrases on it, Adams suggested including Hengist and Horsa, the mythic brothers who appear in Joffrey's history as well as the chronicles of other early British historians like Bede, leading the Anglo-Saxon invasion of Britain. Their names literally mean stallion and horse. They didn't end up going with this idea, but we could have had these pagan figures who led a pagan invasion of Christian Britain on our seal. The government of the United States was also influenced, of course, by British common law and the Germanic pagan legal customs. Long before Christianity reached Northern Europe, Germanic and Norse tribes held something which they called things, which were basically assemblies where free men debated laws, resolved disputes, and would vote. And this kind of proto-democratic tradition of self-rule really had the same roots as Athenian democracy and the Roman Republic, because they were all based in the Indo-European idea of the free man and the sovereign people. Kings were an important part of the Indo-European tradition, but not in the style of Christian monarchs. Sparta had a kingship, but two kings held joint rule, and they were checked by councils and voting assemblies. Similarly, in England, the Anglo-Saxons had the Witan, a council of elders who selected kings by consensus, not by divine right, and this idea of folk right, the customary law of the people, influenced colonial American legal thinking. All of this goes back to the pagan legal customs of Europe, and is very different from Christian monarchy, which was influenced by the idea of the Roman emperor, of course. And in Christian monarchy, the king is mandated by God. This is actually a major reason that the Norse converted to Christianity. The kings would convert because Christian monarchy gave them great advantages in their kingship, which they did not otherwise enjoy. And this is why the conversion of the North was largely top-down from kings. Even something like the classically American right to bear arms does not find its origins in the Bible. It comes from the pagan cultures which revered the free warrior, the warrior who has a right to defend himself against his king, to kill his king if he thinks that his king is not doing a good job. You obviously can't do this if your king is divinely mandated and represents God himself. With the pioneers of the American frontier, we saw a reemergence of the ancient steppe lifestyle of the Indo-Europeans. Rugged warriors pushing the boundaries of the known world, their women and children following behind in wagons to settle the land. And with the later cowboys of the American West, there was a reemergence of the nomadic horseback warrior, last seen in the medieval knight, but now dueling for their honor with revolvers instead of swords. Though most of these warriors and explorers in this last great heroic age were Christians, the spirit and foundations of America were not. America, in its essence, was the last truly free manifestation of the animating heroic spirit of European civilization. It was not an abstract idea founded on Christian principles. It was a new Rome, built on a continent given by God to the Anglo-Saxons, just as Jupiter had given Italy to Aeneas. Of course, America has changed a lot since then. I don't think you could argue that it still has a pagan spirit, unfortunately. So it makes sense why people want to try to ground America in Christianity, since Christianity is the last vestige of traditionalism left to us in the United States. I talked about the decline of Rome in my last video, and the decline of the United States closely mirrors Rome's decline and eventual collapse. But the reason why the decline of the United States is so monumental is this. In forgetting the origins of the United States, we also forget what Western civilization is. We forget the history which binds Western civilization together, both mythic history and the narrative building, and the very real historical, cultural, ethnic, linguistic, and religious pan-European ties which they reflect. We begin saying silly things like, the United States is built on Christian values, or Enlightenment values, or liberal values, or any of these other superficial catchphrases. But for those of us who have an awareness of the historical, mythological, and religious history of the West, these very deep roots, the question is not, how do we get back, how do we return, how do we revert to Christian values, liberal values, and so on, but rather, to what shores will our journey take us next? On what continent, and in what form, will the heroic spirit of the West emerge again from this age of iron?